From the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm Stewart Patrick, and this is The World Unpacked. The global hunger crisis has reached unprecedented levels. Violent conflict, economic shocks from the war in Ukraine, and accelerating climate change have exacerbated food shortages in many parts of the world. According to the World Food Program, 828 million people, that's 1 in 10 people on Earth, are unsure of where their next meal is coming from. More than 345 million face extreme food insecurity. That's more than double the number in 2020, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Joining me today to discuss the many facets of the global hunger crisis is Michelle Nunn. Michelle is president and CEO of CARE USA, one of the world's oldest and largest humanitarian organizations. Founded in 1945, CARE is on the ground, saving lives in 111 countries around the world. In her role, Michelle leads a global team of 7,000 people that takes a holistic approach to crisis response, one that promotes and delivers food and water security, education and employment opportunities, essential health services, climate change adaptation, and gender equality. Prior to serving at CARE, Michelle co-founded and led the volunteer mobilization organization Hands On Atlanta, which later merged with President George H.W. Bush's Points of Light, the world's largest volunteer service network. A program note for our listeners: please stay tuned after my chat with Michelle for a special announcement. And with that, let's dive in. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Stewart. It's great to be with you.
Well, let's start with a pretty broad question. Can you educate us about the scale of global food insecurity today and how it differs from what we've seen before?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep into context sort of at the macro level and sort of even at the generational level that we've made great progress over the decades in both overcoming poverty and also defeating hunger. And so if you think about the statistics in 1990, we were both well within our lifetime, right, as you're young adults. But at that point, we would see something like 35% of the overall population was living in poverty. Now we see something like 10% of the overall population living in poverty. And so we have seen really a positive and optimistic trend lines there. And the same would be true in terms of hunger. But if you look at the numbers today, over the last few years, we have seen a real reversal on some of those trends and on hunger in particular. And right now, we have what is really an unprecedented hunger crisis over the course of the last number of decades. And when I say that unprecedented, it means that it is global in nature. And there are multiple countries that are suffering high thresholds of hunger, food insecurity. You mentioned some of those numbers, but when you think about 1 in 10 people that is going to bed hungry, for instance, every day, that is a real crisis and one that, again, if you think about it on the positive side, that we have the capacity to address proactively with global and collective action and investment into both short and long-term strategies. But at this moment, the world is not living into that global responsibility. And there are these forces that you've mentioned that are going against our progress, things like the climate crisis and also issues of conflict and economic and inflationary forces that are making all of these things much worse.
I want to get into some of those issues as we proceed in our conversation. But first, can you give us a sense of which countries and regions are suffering the most in the current crisis?
Yeah. CARE operates in, for instance, 110 different countries around the world. And yet, if you look at, for instance, where the hunger crisis is really acute, we're talking about 40 or 50 countries. One of the things that's been hard over these last years is when you have, for instance, the COVID crisis, it used to be CARE has 75 years of experience in working with humanitarian crisis, and we could focus our attention in certain countries or regions. But when you have a pandemic, you're are operating across the world. And right now, in terms of the hunger crisis, you're talking about dozens and dozens of countries, but really acute hunger in places like the Horn of Africa right now has been an unprecedented drought, for instance, over the last years that have created, really a kind of physical deprivation in terms of crops and the capacity to grow food that is unprecedented in historical times that we are aware of. And then you also have a number of countries that had been dependent upon food imports from Ukraine and also from, for instance, fertilizer from Russia. The conflict has made it much worse for many of these countries, and for instance, the Middle East as an example. And then you have countries that are living in crisis of conflict, and many of them over long periods of time. So that includes places like Syria, that includes places like Yemen and Afghanistan. And always when we see conflict, we also see hunger.
I'd love to get into some of those drivers of the global food crisis. The World Food Program has mentioned a number of the ones that you have, violent conflict, economic shocks, including from both the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, climate extremes, fertilizer prices, again, at least in part from the war in Ukraine, and the spikes in fuel prices and the inputs to that. How would you rank these? And is this sort of an unprecedented constellation in which these factors are mutually reinforcing?
Yeah, it is a real confluence, and as you say, it's sort of the perfect storm in a number of countries. So you have places, as I mentioned, like the Horn of Africa, which are having through again climate change, have had years and years of 5 failed years of no rain and the inability of growing food. So if you think about that, that is, I mean, even when you look at some of the famine-like conditions in places like Somalia in the 80s, the actual drought conditions are worse than they have ever been. The good news is that there has been some mitigation, that we've gotten better from a governmental perspective, from a humanitarian intervention, so we can stave off the very worst of that hunger crisis to date. But that still can mean that hundreds of people are dying each day, but it's versus thousands that might have been dying in a famine-like situation in the 1980s. So you think about the issues of climate. As I said, always when you have these prolonged conflicts, issues of hunger go along with them, and it does feel like every time we the sort of world turns, we see another issue. So if you think about, for instance, the explosion in the dam in Ukraine, and you consider that Ukraine has really been, as we all know, the breadbasket of the world in so many ways that we might not have appreciated fully until the conflict, and then you think that it's estimated that 20% of the food crops that are grown in Ukraine will not have the capacity for the irrigation that was dependent upon the waters flowing through that dam. You really start to have these ripple impacts that continue and grow. You think about the crisis in Sudan, the conflict. Over half of the people living in Sudan right now are in need of humanitarian assistance. 80% of the people in Yemen, and we have a decade-long crisis there, are in need of humanitarian assistance. So it's hard to say which factor is worse because it's contextual. But even in countries that have been emerging into middle income status, for instance, in Ghana, are seeing issues of this combination of climate, of the inflationary prices, and also of issues of, for instance, the kind of conflict that is bleeding down into northern Ghana, and you really do start to see that even people that were doing well are now facing issues of hunger, and that's again even in lower middle income countries, and certainly in fragile countries.
When you look up around the world, are there some commonalities with respect to the food shortages in terms of the particular crops that are not being produced? Or is this a case of, in particular, of supply chains that have been blocked because of the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, the supply chain issue is enormous, and we saw that in COVID, and it continued to grow when we had or continued to extend itself even beyond COVID, and now we see that in the Ukraine conflict specifically. If you think about, just as we said, the grain situation and as the breadbasket Ukraine is for the world in so many ways, so that crop alone creates an enormous set of impacts for especially countries. Some countries, again, in the Middle East are getting more than 50% of their grain inputs from Ukraine alone. So again, you can imagine the implications of that. But you also then do have climate change, so that crops that are grown locally and upon which people are dependent are either facing, in some instances, drought, as I mentioned, in the Horn of Africa, or they're actually experiencing, alternatively, drought and then flooding. And so you have a devastating set of circumstances for smallholder farmers. And the majority of people who are living in the most desperate and extreme poverty are smallholder farmers. And so again, ironically perhaps, but those people who are often facing the greatest hunger are those who are producing our food. And what they're also experiencing is, as we talked about the supply chain, that the inputs into their food structures, whether that's fertilizer or seeds, are increasing dramatically in terms of price points. And so all of that combines to make it very difficult. But I don't want to leave people feeling hopeless, because there are strategies. We have everything from, really technological innovations around seeds that are resilient to drought, to the capacity for sort of extension services that help support and train farmers in ways of growing crop, of irrigating, of finding new methodologies for withstanding extreme temperatures. So we can and should both take the approach of, in some instances, we have to literally bring grain and food supplies. I was just in Kenya looking at refugee camps and situations there. And as I said, in some instances, we are literally bringing in foodstuffs. And in other instances, it is taking that mid to longer term approach in which we are helping smallholders be able to withstand the shocks that we know are coming, but give the capacity for them to, through a diversified income structure, through a variety of different mechanisms, like helping them on having multiple sources and multiple crop sources, so that if one fails, they have others. So again, part of this is we have a global opportunity to invest in the future and to stem the tide of this crisis in ways that will be both saving lives and also building the capacity for the future for literally hundreds of millions of people.
You anticipated the next question I was going to ask, which is really reflecting on the fact that the global food crisis is both an immediate emergency and a long-term threat to sustainable development. And I'm curious about how you see and think about these dual challenges of providing humanitarian relief and dealing with the underlying causes of food insecurity, given their different timeframes and also often the different actors involved. There's often said in the international aid community that there's not a lot of good lash up between the humanitarian actors and development actors who are there maybe for the long term. How does CARE navigate these twin challenges of the emergency response and the sort of long-term requirements of food security?
Well, we think it's incredibly important that we do knit them together. And so, CARE was actually born post-World War II with the idea of care packages to people who are hungry. So we continue in that mission of emergency response of what we call saving lives, but also the partner to that for us is defeating poverty over the long term. And actually, they do go together because, as an example, if you think about, as I visited, for instance, pastoralists on the border of Somalia, they said they were actually being given the provision of USAID supplies, so food provided by the people of America that they were coming to pick up. And what they said was, "Thank you literally to the people of America for helping save our lives. And what we want to be able to do is to build a sustainable future. And we want to be able to have livelihoods that that don't call upon the need for us to be recipients of handouts. And so if we can help, for instance, pastoralists who are suffering from these extremes of drought face into more diversified livelihood capacities, and we can give them new forms of revenue streams, and then we can get them above what we call a sort of safety net or poverty line that will make them resilient for the next drought and the drought after that, which surely will come. And so it's really important. CARE just did a report not long ago in which we compared our response to the food crisis in 2008 versus an economic crisis versus our response now. And one of the key lessons is you have to be able to provide that emergency support that literally can, in some instances, help people stay alive. And you also want to make sure that you're equipping them for 2 or 3 years down the line so that we're not facing the exact same crisis that we began with. And the hopeful news is that we do have these strategies that can demonstrate that people can dramatically increase their crop yields, that they can increase their price to when they're selling the market goods, that they can diversify their incomes, and that they can withstand the shocks that we can anticipate are continuing to head our way.
Well, CARE obviously has partners around the world, including with multilateral organizations and donor governments who are trying to tackle famine and hunger worldwide. Can you give us a sense of the role of the UN and bilateral aid agencies and how you cooperate with them when it comes to addressing food insecurity? And are the main problems to effective international cooperation largely funding shortages, or are there other problems that you would identify or areas for improvement?
Yeah, that's such a big question. There are actually a lot of challenges that fit together in that. But I would say, look, the UN and multilateral organizations working in combination with state governments and with local communities, local organizations, international organizations like CARE, it's all a part of this constellation that's important to, I think, addressing the challenges that we face today and that we will face in the future. I think we also, have to recognize that there's a couple of things that need to change. Much of the humanitarian system is actually built and predicated upon responses that we did 70 years ago. So the average stay of a refugee, so to speak, or displacement of a refugee can be upwards towards 20 years. Most of our humanitarian system was actually built around an expectation that might be months or a year or two. So there's sort of a global, what is the humanitarian infrastructure that we need to build? We have over 100 million people that are displaced right now. Majority of them are within countries. We also have actually most refugees, people in for instance, the global north or Europe or America may think, well, we're taking in a lot of refugees. We're taking in a very tiny percentage of the world's population of refugees. Most of them are actually being taken in and supported by either low-income countries or lower middle-income countries. So we really need to think about what is that burden share or responsibility share across the world as we look into some of these challenges. We have a funding challenge. If you look at what the UN says is required in almost any situation, whether that's Sudan or Yemen, most of the time you'll see that we're at about 20% of what they say is required. So collectively, the global community is not investing enough in the short term or the long term solutions. And then we have, I think we have the opportunity, again, on the upside, to think about what are new opportunities for technology, innovation, artificial intelligence. Surely we can put some of these possibilities to good use to solving big problems that are before us. And then I think we also do have a political will problem. We just saw that the House came out with a 30% cut in their international affairs budget. Much of that goes to aid. So at a time of unprecedented crisis, we're actually talking about cutting when we should be thinking about expanding. And that's just thinking what is in our best interest, both globally, but also nationally in terms of national security, economic interdependence, and issues of things like global trade. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in there in terms of what do we need to do differently in order to meet this moment.
Do you think that there's a communications challenge here that can be solved? As you and I both know, trying to get support for foreign aid, which doesn't necessarily have a huge domestic constituency in the United States, or at least an obvious one compared to, domestic spending on, say, the roads and other things. Is it simply that people have a misapprehension of the sort of the magnitude? They sort of exaggerate how much the United States is spending on foreign aid? Is it sort of a sense of aid fatigue? Are there, or is it that it's not linked to sort of classic U.S. national interests? Are there ways that that we could build greater support domestically in the United States and political support on Capitol Hill for this kind of spending?
I certainly think it's possible, but we do struggle with it. And I think it's a combination of those things. If you ask people how much of the U.S. budget goes to international aid, sometimes people will say 20 or 30 or 40%. It's a fraction of 1%. And so I think it's a misapprehension around the proportionality of our current investment. I think it is a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding. And I think, this is one of the problems, because as we talk about these big challenges, I think people can become overwhelmed or think, well, what can we do here? Or get a kind of sense of compassion fatigue. But we're not talking enough about, there are solutions, and we actually see amazing results of some of the progress and work that we've been putting into play around everything from reproductive health to immunization rates to, until recently, as I mentioned, issues around hunger and child malnutrition. So I think we need to, as we're talking about the needs, we also need to remind people that they have been very concrete gains. There is meaningful impact, and there are real solutions, because people are willing to invest if they think it's going to work. But if they somehow don't think it's going to work, then why would you continue to invest? And so I think we have to do a better job of selling the solutions as well as the problems as we go forward. And I do think that that congressional members, we have had traditionally pretty strong bipartisan support, but we do need to make sure that our citizenry understands the context. And I think it's both an appeal to, I hope that they can understand as I said, sort of the economic opportunity to tell the story. We certainly, if you look at our former aid partners of France and Germany and under the Marshall Plan, or Korea at one point, these are incredibly important partners to us now. If you think about the national security issue, we know that, for instance, that these places of conflict that we hope will not spread are sometimes rooted in issues of food insecurity or of poverty, and so how can we be proactive around that? And then I really do genuinely believe that the American people ultimately take pride in their leadership as humanitarian nation, and I think people can respond to that. And as I take congressional members to see some of this work, there is, a lot of pride when they see these food parcels that say this is a gift of the American people.
Yeah, absolutely. So the appeal to both the head and the heart is very important. When we come back, I'll ask Michelle about how recent events around the world have worsened the global food crisis. Hey, World Unpacked listeners. I've got a podcast recommendation for you if you're into all things Europe. Brought to you by my colleagues at Carnegie Europe, Europe Inside Out delves deep into the complex foreign policy challenges Europe faces, where the continent stands, and where it's heading. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts. So back in March, Michelle, you wrote an op-ed in the Hill newspaper calling for international actors to redouble their humanitarian and development support for Ukraine as the war enters its second year. You also highlighted that it's not just the Ukrainian people who'll need assistance, but other affected communities as well. So can you tell us a little bit about the current food situation in Ukraine itself? Is CARE operating there?
CARE is operating there, and we work through close to 25 partners. We engage and have supported close to 1 million people, and that's everything from just immediate shelter and support around water and food. As any conflict situation, any war where civilians are involved, you have people that are unable to to feed themselves based upon just the nature of the conflict. So you have millions of people that have been displaced. Many of them have left Ukraine and are rebuilding lives in other places. Many of them have come back to Ukraine or are staying in Ukraine but are displaced. And so you have, again, issues of shelter, and you have issues, again, of hunger. And then as we've pointed out, and I think I hope that people now understand, the humanitarian crisis of Ukraine has precipitated even greater numbers in terms of people that are facing hunger around the world. And that's, again, because we have Ukraine has been traditionally a great exporter of food and a breadbasket for the world. And so if you think about the conflict, and then you think about, for instance, most recently, the destruction of the dam, that is dramatically exacerbated the issues that are faced with the supply chain of getting food from Ukraine produced and then getting it out into the world. And so all of those pieces are quite precarious. And as the war continues, it also prolongs and extends these issues of hunger that people are facing.
Speaking of precarious, as you know, the Black Sea grain agreement expires next week on July 17th. This is the deal in which Russia agreed to allow grain to leave the ports of Ukraine, and it was brokered last July to help ease the war's impact on the global food crisis. And since then, many millions of tons of grain have been exported. What's at stake if the deal isn't renewed next week, and do you expect it to be renewed?
I mean, I think we really can hope that it will be. And I think there is a great deal at stake. And it is, again, the lives of people who will otherwise face extended hunger. In some instances, we are seeing people who are facing famine-like conditions in places around the world. And so I think what seems like many people like an abstract, this kind of trade agreement that needs to be brokered with these parties of conflict, it will have enormous stakes for ordinary people around the world. And it's why the UN, but also the collective collaboration of nations around the world is so important. I mean, just as an example, this morning, actually, the UN Security Council, Russia vetoed the ability to import and export humanitarian relief in the borders of northwest Syria. And again, that's not something that makes the headlines for most Americans, but there are hundreds of thousands of people living in North Syria that are dependent upon thousands of trucks being able to move over the course of a year through a route that was just literally closed as a result of this UN decision today. We hope that there will be further action and that this will be resolved. But these rather seemingly esoteric UN decisions are real life implicators into the life and death situation for hundreds of thousands and even millions of people around the world.
So besides issues of humanitarian access, I wonder whether or not there could be at least partial relief in situations like this if the world had a sufficient stockpiles. One talks about the strategic petroleum reserve, for instance, in the United States. Now, maybe this is far too simplistic, but one could imagine that given how bountiful crop production is in many parts of the world in normal circumstances, is there any talk of, or have there been any moves to create sort of standing supplies that could be made available in humanitarian disasters, or are there practical difficulties with that?
Yeah, I think, look, there are important ways in which, especially in regions in which we know that we face ongoing food crisis, where stockpiles of food and the ability to, I would say, pre-organize that stockpiling is really important. It's one of the, I think, important lessons of also this humanitarian imperative that's before us is to not only be reactive, but to be proactive. And there's a number of things that we can do. We have actually even scientific predictors now in terms of weather patterns that can tell us, I mean, our teams can tell you where there is going to be a hunger crisis in a year. But we don't always, because of the combination of human nature, psychology, the collective slowness of bureaucracies, the grinding of resolutions between the UN, we don't always actually preemptively get in front of crises that we know are coming. So there is actually quite a lot that we could do in the regard that you just suggest around getting in front of these issues. And that includes not only sort of stockpiling food and transporting food to the places where it is needed, because that is actually a more both is capital intensive versus also ensuring that we are providing the kind of, as we said, crop extension services, training, resilient seeds, irrigation support, even things like electricity that helps propel some of the farming techniques, et cetera, that will be required for you to build sustainable agriculture that is locally based and that can not disrupting the markets through the intervention of external supply. That's the ultimate answer, but CARE, for instance, has something we call a humanitarian surge fund. And instead of asking people to contribute just when they start to see something on the television screen, because by then you're already in response. But if you invest, for instance, in a surge fund, you can help us pre-position supplies where we know Haiti and we know that, for instance, in a hurricane, that one bridge in the community always washes away, and the people on the other side of that bridge are going to be stranded without food for weeks. So getting pre-stocked supplies is just, a micro example of that kind of macro view that you're pointing out. And it's part of the larger sort of systems change that I think from a global humanitarian infrastructure that we need to get smarter about.
One of the mechanisms that seems to be recurrent, which and both sort of on an annual basis, but then also on a periodic basis when there is a major a catastrophe or major humanitarian emergency are high-level pledging events where countries get together and say, and international agencies and say, we will pledge this amount for this particular contingency. There was recently a UN high-level pledging event on the Horn of Africa, which, as you mentioned, is at the core of one of the heart of the world's largest climate emergencies, as well as lots of violent conflict, which is worse than the food crisis there. What was the outcome of that Horn of Africa pledging conference, and were you satisfied with it?
Well, unfortunately, no, we were not satisfied with it. And it was there was a call for, in an immediate sense, a $7 billion investment to meet the needs in Ethiopia and Kenya and Somalia. As I said, catastrophic drought, conflict, rising costs, all of these things. And unfortunately, only 2.4 billion was committed, and again, that's only touching the surface of what's needed to sort of move through this crisis. I do think, again, I want to share on the positive news and to remind people that these interventions do work. As I was visiting the Horn of Africa over the last year, and I repeatedly talked to UN officials and then local government officials who said that the U.S. investment in the Horn of Africa over the last couple of years has truly prevented famine. And so this, sometimes we sort of, you feel that there's the warnings, but you don't hear and we did stave off hunger. And I mean, we did stave off famine, for instance, in places like Ethiopia or Kenya or Somalia. And again, famine has a specific kind of a political context and a very strict definition. But we are seeing that these interventions work when we make the investment. But the global community, and I would say, the U.S. needs to lead, but we also need to see our partners around the world to come to the table as well.
When it comes to climate change, one of the things that obviously we've seen, with this sort of parade of days, which are every day is hotter than the next in sort of world history or in the last 120,000 years, the combination of climate change plus demographic change, that is population growth in some of these very fragile countries, would lead one to suggest that maybe these famines that we've thought about as being periodic or in a sense chronic, and this is just going to be sort of the new reality and the new normal. Do you see some of these pressures not being just in the Horn of Africa, but spreading globally as climate change accelerates? And again, there's many parts of the world are no longer growing demographically, but others continue to be gaining population at quite a fast clip. Are there strategies and sort of adaptations that the international community needs to make in different parts of the world to actually address this constellation of crises, which may become sort of a permanent fixture, at least for the foreseeable future in the world?
Yeah, look, I think that there are absolutely, we can feed the world. The world can feed itself, even in these times of crisis, but it does take a short and long-term investment. If you think about, for instance, one of the things, again, giving people some hope, women smallholder farmers are categorically limited in terms of their access to markets, in terms of their access to seeds and crops and training. There's been studies that have said that if women smallholder farmers around the world had equal access to men, we could feed 150 million more people in the world. And that's just one of the strategies that would make a difference. We also know that if we started to really invest in the just adaptation that needs to happen around climate change, we all know that those who have been least a part of the climate change crisis are those who are most impacted by it. And we are seeing that growing terrain of for instance, we talked about the Horn of Africa, but you're seeing parts of West Africa. You're seeing, again, and we're going to see that increasingly true, and especially those places that are already in some measure, whether it's fragile states, whether that's places of conflict, whether that's places of extreme poverty, you're seeing those people affected the most as it relates to issues of climate. So just a more just investment in the adaptation for climate change would make a dramatic difference. And then, as we say, I think we can be hopeful about new technology. We can be hopeful about diversification of incomes. There's a whole host of things that can be done, but it will take more investment, collective investment, and I think even some transformation of our current systems towards more agile and effective capacities, and also, again, more collective responsibility ultimately.
That's a really wonderful note to end on, because obviously we've talked about many of the challenges, but as you said at the beginning of the show, we've made tremendous development progress just extraordinary declines in the overall global levels of poverty, increases in global health, far fewer people hungry today than there were decades ago. And yet, obviously, we've had some setbacks and sort of thrown development into reverse a bit here over the last several years. But as you're pointing out, there are some solutions. There are new ways of approaching climate change and food insecurity the same way. And I really appreciate you calling attention to the fact that there are, some hopeful stories out there and some hopeful approaches. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here on The World Unpacked, and we look forward to hopefully having you back on the show in the future. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to share about this important crisis and hopefully give people a sense of the importance, but also some hopeful possibility for the future.
The World Unpacked will be taking a summer break, but we'll be back in September. In the meantime, I'm excited to announce that we'll be debuting a new podcast miniseries from the Carnegie Endowment called Behind Closed Doors: Corruption in Democracies. It was created and produced by Hee-Won Park, a junior fellow in our Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. Hee-Won is here with me to give us a special preview of this new podcast miniseries. Hee-Won, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Hee-Won, can you give us a brief summary of your podcast?
Yeah, so my podcast is sort of an exploration of global anti-corruption movements. So the first episode starts with the U.S. and kind of looking at what is corruption. You know, we talk about corruption a lot, but people, I think, use this term to refer to lots of things that they don't like bad governance or just even like political parties they don't agree with, right? So taking a deeper look of what is corruption, what's the history of corruption in the U.S., how does corruption differ in the U.S. versus other countries? I think one thing that we talk about in the first episode is there's a perception, I think, often that like certain countries are quote unquote like more corrupt than other countries. But I think it's important to, if you like understand it more and look into it more, it sort of becomes clear that it's more like there are different types of corruption that exist, and some types are more prevalent in certain countries. Other types are more prevalent in other types of places.
So what kind of case studies did you look at? You have 3 episodes. How do they unfold in a general sense?
Yeah, so the first episode looks at the U.S., like I said, and definitions, and uses Rod Blagojevich's, I don't know if you, so Rod Blagojevich was a former Illinois governor a few years ago who, when Barack Obama got elected, he tried to sell Obama's Senate seat, which of course is not legal. The U.S. was the first case study. Then the second episode moves on to Brazil. And looks at the Lava Jato scandal, which was this huge money laundering operation that was, the corruption was operating at extremely high levels, reaching the presidential office in Brazil and implicating like every single political party in Brazil, essentially. I don't want to give too much away, but it's huge construction companies, like all of these private sector businesses were involved in essentially creating cartels and getting overpaid for government contracts and then sending kickbacks to their government crony people. And then the third episode looks at South Korea's impeachment of former President Park Geun-hye. She was embroiled in a political scandal a few years ago, which ultimately led to her impeachment and then her imprisonment as well. And I think a lot of people might know Park Geun-hye for being the first woman president elected in South Korea, for going to jail perhaps, but I think it's a much more complicated story than that. It's her whole family has this really complex legacy of her father was the first, he was a former dictator in South Korea, extremely brutal leader, but also known as the man who created modern South Korea, like built the economy that it is today. So I think it's, it's a really interesting story with like shamans and crazy types of things, like cult leaders, things that like kind of stranger than fiction, you could say. But I think both of these cases, like the Lava Jato and Park Geun-hye's impeachment, are interesting because I think they're not really common knowledge in the U.S., but things that people in South Korea and Brazil, respectively, have really strong feelings on. And I think they were really important historical moments for both countries, national identities and paths.
So how did you come up with this idea? Was it, you've been working in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program here at Carnegie. Mm-hmm. Did something come along that made you intrigued about this topic?
Yeah, so I was working on this project with my supervisor or senior fellow, Rachel Kleinfeld, and the effect of populism and declining democracies on the business community, and looking at various case studies of this. And one of them happened to be Brazil. So I was spending a lot of time researching Lava Jato and learning about how this event had really changed and like transformed Brazil's political landscape. And just learning more and more kind of made me realize, wow, this is such a complicated story and I kept talking about it to my friends, but often they don't want to hear me just like rattle off. And I've always been interested in podcasts and radio as like a form of storytelling. And I love that you can incorporate, it can be educational, informative, but also you can add music and, narrative arcs to make it into a more like artistic experience.
That's terrific. And I have to say that it certainly comes through as a labor of love. And I also want to say how rare it is for anybody, much less somebody who's here, a junior fellow, somebody who just recently graduated from college, to actually be able to produce something like this. So anyway, I want to thank you for taking the time to give our listeners a preview of Behind Closed Doors, Corruption in Democracies. The first episode of the podcast series will air on July 17th. And stick around, folks, to hear an exclusive clip from the first episode.
It's one of humanity's oldest stories, the misuse of power for private gain. There are records of corruption as far back as Egypt, circa 3000 BCE. We all know corruption is still a big problem today. But how big? That's debatable. A lot of numbers get thrown around. The World Bank estimates that we lose at least $2.6 trillion of world GDP every year to corruption. Other researchers dispute the credibility of this number, but no one denies that corruption is costly to societies everywhere. It can damage democratic institutions and destroy a society's faith in the integrity of their political system.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked, brought to you by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and please don't forget to rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Isabel Villegas and Clarissa Guerrero and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. Catch you next time.